By the second week of August 1970, there were 4,000 acres of corn dying in Hardin County, Iowa, and not one man who planted it could tell you why. They had done everything right. They had bought the newest seed, the certified hybrid, the same variety their neighbors planted fence to fence across the whole county. And now it was turning gray on the stalk, the leaves blotching brown, the ears rotting inside the husk while the plant still stood. At the coffee counter in Eldora, the same men who had spent 8 years laughing at Ruth Halvorsen had gone quiet, because there was one field in the county that was still green. It belonged to a 52-year-old widow who could not afford to lose a single acre. A woman with a banknote coming due that October and a son who had begged her, all spring, to stop farming like it was 1935. She had planted the seed she saved by hand. The seed everyone told her to throw away. What happened that autumn changed the way this country thinks about a single kernel of corn. But to understand how Ruth Halvorsen got there, we have to go back to 1962, to a cellar in a farmhouse on the flat black ground of central Iowa, and to a man named Walter. There is a rule in farm country that nobody writes down but everybody learns. And by 1962, in Hardin County, Iowa, the rule was this: you buy your seed, every year, new. It had not always been that way. Ruth's father, and his father before him, had saved their own seed the way farmers had for 10,000 years. You kept back the best ears from your best plants, dried them in the crib, and planted them the following spring. The corn you grew was the corn you owned. But something had changed in American agriculture, and it had changed fast. In a single generation, hybrid corn had swept across the Middle West like weather. The new hybrids grew taller, stood straighter, yielded more. Sometimes 20, sometimes 30 bushels an acre more than the old open-pollinated varieties. The numbers were real. The men who switched made money. And there was one catch that most farmers never thought hard about. Hybrid seed does not breed true. Save the seed from a hybrid ear, plant it next year, and the crop comes up uneven and weak, a scatter of runts and throwbacks. The vigor is gone in a single generation. Which meant that every spring, every farmer had to go back to the dealer and buy again. By 1962, the old way of saving seed had become something worse than old-fashioned. It had become a mark against you. To the men at the coffee counter, it meant one of two things. Either you were too stubborn to accept progress, or you were too broke to buy in. Neither one was a compliment. The rule was sacred. And Ruth Halvorsen was about to break it. Ruth Halvorsen married Walter Halvorsen in the spring of 1939, when she was 21. Walter was not a loud man. He was a careful one. He farmed 160 acres of corn and hay on ground his family had worked since the 1880s. He read. He kept notebooks. And where nearly every other man in the township had gone over to buying hybrid seed by the middle of the 1950s, Walter Halvorsen kept saving his own. He was not against hybrids. He understood the yield numbers as well as anyone. But Walter had grown up hearing his father talk about the corn. Dozens of old open-pollinated strains, each adapted over generations to one patch of Iowa dirt, each carrying a pocket of difference from all the others. And Walter had come to believe something he could not always put into words, that when every farmer in a county plants the exact same seed, the county has quietly bet everything on one hand of cards. So Walter kept his corn, the best ears every fall, dried and shelled into glass jars down in the cool dark of the farmhouse cellar. Dozens of jars, labeled in his own hand, some of the strains going back further than anyone could say. Ruth stood beside him at that work for 30 years. She learned to read a plant the way Walter read one. It was quietly the thing the two of them did together. Walter died in the winter of 1961. His heart in his sleep at 63 years old. He left Ruth the 160 acres, a barn that needed a roof, a note at the Hardin County Bank that still had years to run, and a cellar full of glass jars. He also left her a son. Danny Halvorsen was 23 that year, and Danny loved his mother, and Danny thought the jars in the cellar were a beautiful, sentimental, expensive mistake. He had done the arithmetic on hybrid yields, and the arithmetic was not on his father's side. "Ma," he told her more than once in the years after Walter was gone, "we can't farm on feeling. Not with the note. Everybody plants the hybrid. There's a reason." And the hard part, the part that sat in Ruth's chest like a stone, was that Danny was not wrong. Not about the yields. Not about the note. He was standing on solid ground, asking her to stand there with him. She just could not make herself let go of the jars. If Danny was the voice of doubt inside the house, Carl Beckman was the voice of it everywhere else. Carl Beckman ran the seed and feed on the edge of Eldora and had since 1949. And you have to understand Carl before you decide what you think of him, because it would be easy, and wrong, to make him the villain of this story. Carl was not a swindler. Carl was a believer. He had watched hybrid corn transform the fortunes of Hardin County with his own eyes. Families barely hanging on in 1948, putting new roofs on by 1958, and he believed, with the whole force of an honest man's conviction, that the hybrid seed had done it. And he was, in the plainest sense, usually right. In an ordinary year, the hybrid did yield more, and the farmers who listened to Carl Beckman made money. He had 2 decades of good harvests to prove it. So when the widow Halvorsen kept planting her dead husband's saved corn, Carl did not see harmless stubbornness. He saw a woman he'd known 30 years making a mistake that could cost her the farm, and he said so. Not cruelly. He said it the way you'd warn a friend off thin ice. Ruth, he told her one spring morning at the counter with 3 other men standing there, "Nobody admired Walter more than I did, but Walter's gone, and that corn in your cellar is a museum. You've got a boy to think about. This isn't 1935. The men laughed. Not at her, exactly. They laughed the easy laugh of people who all agree, the laugh that lets everybody know which side of a thing the sensible people stand on. And it went around the county the way those things do. Ruth Halvorsen, planting jar corn, farming with her husband's ghost. There was affection in some of it. But there was a verdict in it too, and Ruth heard the verdict. She bought her fertilizer, said thank you, and drove home. And that night she wrote something in one of Walter's old notebooks. The date, and then, word for word, what Carl Beckman had said. This isn't 1935. She did not underline it. She just kept it. By the spring of 1970, Ruth Halvorsen was 52 and farming on a margin with no room left in it. The note Walter had left at the Hardin County Bank had a balloon payment coming due that October. A little over $4,000, most of a year's corn income off 160 acres. She had made every payment for 9 years. This was the last big one. If the crop came in strong, she would clear the note, and the ground her husband's family had farmed since the 1880s would be free and clear for the first time in Ruth's life. If the crop failed, the bank would take the ground. That was the arithmetic, and Danny knew it cold. That spring, he made his stand. He sat down at the kitchen table and told his mother he'd gone to Carl Beckman and priced enough certified hybrid seed to plant the whole 160. 1 year, Ma, he said. We plant it the way everybody plants it. We make the note, and then you can do whatever you want. He was not being cruel. He was frightened, trying to save the farm, asking his mother to trust the same seed the whole county trusted. Ruth understood every word of it, and she told him no. She told him she would plant Walter's corn. All of it. The open-pollinated strains from the cellar, the ones she and Walter had kept for 30 years. She could not have told you, that night, exactly why. It was not a business decision. It went deeper. Into some place where the jars and the man who had filled them and the ground were all the same thing. Danny stood up from the table. He did not shout. He said, very quietly, that if she lost the farm doing this, he did not know that he could stay and watch. And then he went out to the barn. So Ruth planted mostly alone that spring. Her husband's corn across the whole 160 acres of Halvorsen ground, while every other field in Hardin County went in with the same certified hybrid, the same variety, the same seed. From the road, come July, the county was a single unbroken sea of identical corn. And in one field, in the middle of it, something a little different was growing. Nobody had any reason to notice. The corn came up. The summer turned hot. And somewhere far to the south, on the warm, wet air, something was coming north that no one in Iowa had heard of. It had a name, though almost no farmer in Iowa knew it that summer. Southern cornleaf blight, a fungus always around in a mild form, mostly a nuisance in the south. But in the late 1960s, a new, far more aggressive strain had appeared, what scientists would later call race T, and race T had found something about American corn that American corn had done to itself. Nearly every hybrid planted in the country that year shared one piece of hidden machinery. To make hybrid seed cheaply, the seed companies had bred in something called Texas cytoplasm, a trait that spared them the labor of removing pollen tassels by hand. It was an elegant shortcut, and it meant a huge share of American corn was, at one hidden point, genetically the very same plant. And race T was keyed to that trait like a key to a lock. Ruth first saw it on a Sunday morning in the second week of August. The air had been thick and wet for days, the kind of heavy Iowa August that never cools at night. She was walking the fence line at the north end of her place, where her ground met the Dorland brothers' field, when she stopped. The Dorland corn was going gray. It had been deep green a week before. Now the leaves were streaked with long tan lesions, hundreds of them, thousands, and where the streaks ran together the whole leaf had died and hung down brown. And when she reached across the fence and pulled back the husk on the nearest ear, the cob inside was black with rot, soft, the kernels gray and collapsing. She stood there a long time in the wet morning heat. Then she turned and looked back across her own fence at her own corn. It was green, not perfect. Here and there a leaf carried a lesion. But it was standing, and it was green, and it was alive. Because Ruth Halvorsen's corn was not one plant repeated 10,000 times. It was dozens of old strains mixed together, each one a little different from the next. And the blight that fit the county's hybrid like a key and a lock could find no single lock to open in Ruth's field. What happened over the next 3 weeks, people in Hardin County still talk about. The blight moved through the county like fire through dry grass. Field after field, all the same seed, all carrying the same hidden flaw, went gray and then brown and then down. Corn that should have made 120 bushels an acre came in at 60, at 40, at less. Some fields were not worth the diesel to harvest. The Dorland brothers lost most of theirs. Half the township took the worst harvest of their lives. And there was nothing Carl Beckman could sell to fix it. The seed was already in the ground, and the seed was the problem. And on the Halvorsen place, Ruth's corn stood. It was not a miracle crop. She lost some. But the great mixed field of her husband's saved strains, the museum corn, the jar corn, the corn everybody had told her to throw away. Most of it stood green into September and made ears while the county rotted around it. That fall, off 160 acres the whole coffee counter had already written off, Ruth Halvorsen harvested one of the only full crops in Hardin County. She made the note. On a gray morning in the second week of October, Ruth drove into Eldora and paid the balloon payment at the Hardin County Bank, and for the first time since the 1880s, the Halvorsen ground was owned free and clear. Danny was in the truck beside her. He had not left. He had watched, all through August and September, as the county's fields died and his mother's held. And somewhere in there the argument had gone out of him. He walked into the bank with her. He was the one who carried the payment book. Carl Beckman came out to the Halvorsen farm on a cold afternoon near the end of October. He came in his own truck, alone, unannounced, the way serious men do hard things. Ruth was in the machine shed, Danny with her. Carl got out and stood a moment with his cap in his hands, looking at the crib, which was full, which in Hardin County that year was worth stopping to look at. "Ruth," he said. "Carl." Then he said, "I've been selling seed in this county 21 years, and I've never seen a year like this one." He turned his cap over in his hands. "Your field held." "Some of it," Ruth said. "More than some." He looked at her. "I came to ask you something. I've got 40 farmers who'll need seed corn next spring that isn't all the same thing. Seed that isn't." He stopped, searching for it. "Seed that isn't one plant. You've got the only open corn left in this end of the county. Down in your cellar. Don't you?" Ruth looked at him a long moment. And because she was not a cruel woman either, She did not make him stand in the cold any longer than he had to. "I do," she said. "Walters. 30 years of it." Carl Beckman nodded slowly. "I told you that corn was a museum," he said. "I stood at that counter and told you it was 1935. "I remember," Ruth said. She did. She had it written down, word for word, in Walter's notebook. She did not say so. She did not need to. "I was wrong," Carl said, "and I'd be obliged if you'd let me buy some of that seed. At your price." Ruth was quiet a moment. Then she told him she would think about how many jars she could spare and still keep the strains going, because keeping the strains going, she said, was the whole point, and always had been. Carl put his cap back on and drove back to town. When his truck was gone, Danny said, "You had it written down. What he said to you." "I did," Ruth said. "Why didn't you throw it in his face?" Ruth looked at the full crib and past it at the black October fields where her corn had stood, and she thought about Walter, who had never once thrown anything in anybody's face and had been right anyway and had not lived to see it. "Because being right isn't the same as needing him to feel it," she said. "Your father knew that. That's why I kept the corn and not the argument." Danny did not say anything to that. But that winter, for the first time, he went down into the cellar with his mother and learned the jars. Here is the part that is not a story. The southern corn leaf blight of 1970 was real, and it was one of the worst plant disease epidemics in American history. Race T of the fungus swept up out of the South that summer and destroyed, by the Department of Agriculture's own accounting, close to 15% of the entire American corn crop, over 1 billion bushels, with losses far higher across the South, in places half the crop or more. And the reason it spread the way it did is exactly the reason in this story. By 1970, the great majority of the hybrid corn grown in the United States carried the same Texas male sterile cytoplasm, the same hidden trait, bred in for the seed company's convenience. The country had, without ever deciding to plant it, a single genetic weakness from one end of the corn belt to the other, and a disease that fit that weakness found almost nothing to stop it. The blight was beaten back the following year, when the seed companies rushed to older methods and widened their genetic base. But the lesson did not go away. The National Academy of Sciences studied the disaster and handed American agriculture a warning, the same one Walter Halvorsen kept trying to put into words in his cellar. When everyone plants the exact same thing, everyone shares the exact same risk. Genetic diversity is not sentiment. It is insurance. It is why today there are seed banks, cold vaults holding thousands of old, open-pollinated varieties kept alive on purpose, because someone finally understood what a widow in Hardin County understood in 1970 with a cellar full of her husband's glass jars. So here is the question I want to leave with you tonight. Everyone around you is doing the sensible thing, the modern thing, the thing that works. This year, would you have the nerve to keep the old jars? Could you stand at that counter, take the laughter, drive home, and plant your own corn anyway? Tell me down in the comments about a time you held on to the old way when everyone told you to let it go, and whether the years proved you right. I read every one. And if this story meant something to you, stay a while. There's more of this country's quiet history to tell.